The New York Mets continue to be linked to Luis Robert in trade talks, and they also missed out on a couple of first basemen on Sunday. Is this team focused on the outfield to make their next big move?
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. On the show today, we're going to talk about Luis Robert because the New York Mets continue to be linked to him in trade rumors. I'll discuss the rumor in the first segment and why Robert does make some sense to complete the Mets outfield. In the second segment, I'll talk about what they should realistically put on the table if they are to trade for Robert, because you shouldn't trade much for a guy that's been bad for the last 2 years and is making $20 million this upcoming season. Final segment, we're going to talk about the moves that weren't made by the New York Mets. Willson Contreras traded from the Cardinals to the Red Sox. Did the Mets miss the boat on another addition that could help their infield? And did they not make this trade because they're happy to stay internal at first base and DH? We're going to go through it all, but first, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. I've been covering the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. This is the #1 daily podcast on the New York Mets. Want to find any of my written work, you can do so over at justbaseball.com, where I work as the editor-in-chief. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. If you want to be right in the middle of the action this season, visit FanDuel.com and place your NFL live bets all season long. All right, so once again, we have a report. The Mets are engaged in trade talk for Luis Robert Jr. This came from Bob Nightingale after the Munetaka Murakami signing was announced. Nightingale, he gets things wrong, but he also is a plugged-in MLB insider, and if there is a team that he's more connected on than any other, it's the White Sox. So I do take this at face value a little bit. He said that the Mets and the Reds were engaged in talks to trade for Luis Robert. And ultimately, there's just been so much smoke around a Mets-Luis Robert trade dating back to the deadline that I do think under the right context, the Mets would like to add Luis Robert into the fold because they probably believe that he's going to be much better away from the White Sox in a different uniform than he's been in Chicago the last couple seasons, because quite frankly, he hasn't been a very good baseball player overall. His OPS has been well below 700 the last 2 years. His WRC plus, which is weighted runs created plus, has been at 84. So he's been 16% worse than your league average hitter of 100 WRC plus. So not very good offensively. He's an injury risk as well. He's only played over 110 games once in his career. That came back in 2023 when he had his career year where he played 145 games. But this past season, playing 110, second most he's ever played throughout his big league career. So that's all of the downside. Where is the plus side on Luis Robert? First and foremost, he's a lefty masher. For his career, a 293 hitter against lefties, an 872 OPS, a 140 WRC plus. Last year, that OPS was 842 against lefties, hit 6 of his 14 home runs against southpaws, and had a 130 WRC plus against lefties. So you can trust he's going to hit left-handed pitching. You can also trust him defensively. Was worth 7 outs above average this past season in center field. That's a very good mark. 90th percentile Major League Baseball in sprint speed. Doesn't have a cannon, but plenty of speed to run down fly balls in the gaps. And his arm is still strong enough. This is not Brandon Nimmo in the outfield. He'll be able to get the ball in. He just doesn't have an absolute chooch out there. But he's a good defensive center fielder. And realistically, what you're looking at on the low end of what Luis Robert could provide is what you would have hoped Tyrone Taylor would have provided the last couple years, as far as being a right-handed bat that can be your fourth outfielder that can hit left-handed pitching. But if the Mets were to trade for Luis Robert, he's not going to be a fourth outfielder right away. They would give him spring training to hopefully get him in a good place, and they would give him the beginning of the season to try to be the Mets starting center fielder because of the upside that he possesses. And I will say, when it was time to try to play himself off of the White Sox before the trade deadline in July last year, this is why he sold me at the time on being a trade candidate the Mets should have tried to pull the trigger on. I think that Chris Getz was just and has been just completely unrealistic in his ask for Robert. But what he did in July prior to the deadline, he cut his strikeout rate from 30% all year long to 16.9%. He hit 353. He got on base at a 441 clip, and he slugged at a 549 clip. So he posted a 990 OPS that month with a 176 WRC plus. It was a month, but it showed that it's still in there. And I think the motivation of trying to play himself off of the White Sox is one of the reasons why he put it all together. I think this is a guy that's been trapped in purgatory the last couple of years on a terrible team, and it's tough to be the one guy that's playing good baseball on a bad team. Now, you still prefer the guys who are going to get the numbers regardless of the situation, but I think there's enough of a reason when it comes to that month of July he's had, the 2023 season he had, where he hit the 38 bombs in 145 games. There's enough of an upside here that he's an intriguing change of scenery candidate, and then the floor is high enough when you're talking about the defense he would bring to the table and the ability to mash left-handed pitching, as well as the fact that he stole 30 bases while not getting on base at a high clip last year. So there's the base stealing component as well, where I think he can do enough for your team if the whole bet doesn't work out and he's not good enough to be your starting center fielder. If Carson Bench is your starting center fielder and there are some days where you're moving him over to left because Luis Robert is going to start against lefties, or you're platooning those guys in center field because I don't know who your left fielder would be at that point that would be good enough that, maybe it's Jet Williams who's, going to play against lefties. We'll see what the total, picture would look like at that point in time. But I think, again, the floor of a lefty masher who is still very strong defensively in center and good on the base pass, that floor is enough that he's not going to be a wasted roster spot if the change of scenery bet doesn't pay off. And if it does pay off, you're talking about a guy that would really transform this lineup if he can get back to the best version of himself, which I understand is a little bit doubtful, but even if he gets to 70% of that and he's holding his own against right-handed pitching, posting a WRC plus that's over 100, but doesn't have to be much beyond that, while mashing lefties, even then the defensive value and what he would be providing with his bat would probably be, a 3-win player pretty comfortably. So it's a risky one. And I understand why fans are not in on this acquisition. That's why I've strayed away from talking about it for a little bit. Where I can get my head around it is just looking at the lack of other options, because we're getting closer and closer to Jeff McNeil just being the Mets starting left fielder with Carson Bench in center. And I think you would like to get to a point where either you trade Jeff McNeil because you moved on from that past core of the Mets, or if you keep him, he's on your bench and you don't have to just automatically give the job to Carson Bench, where you go into spring training and Bench has an opportunity to win the job, but Luis Robert could be your starting center fielder and Jeff McNeil could end up being the stopgap if Bench isn't ready. That's a much better way to have your roster set up going into spring. And the other possible additions, if you're not going to give the years that it's going to take to sign Cody Bellinger or Kyle Tucker, which might be more than 5, and I would do that for Tucker, I don't think I would do that for Cody Bellinger. So if that's off the table, if the ask to get Jarren Duran is Jonah Tong, I don't know if I would do that. 1-for-1 maybe, but personally, I'd rather not trade Jonah Tong. And the more I'm thinking about it, I don't know if I want to trade Brandon Sproat either. So if you want to keep your pitching prospects, this would be the way to get a guy to complete your outfield, because you're pretty much down to, if it's not Jarren Duran, it's not Cody Bellinger, it's not Kyle Tucker, then you're looking at the Max Keplers and Austin Hayes if he hasn't signed yet, and Michael Conforto off of a terrible season. You're running out of options to address your outfield in free agency. You're running out of options in free agency that are better than Jeff McNeil. And the only other trade option is Ramon Laureano, who is a much better hitter than Luis Robert. Not quite the defender, but because he's only making like $6 million, the Padres are not just going to trade him to trade him. It's going to cost a lot more, I would imagine, to get Ramon Laureano than to pick up Luis Robert with the salary that he has. So now the question becomes, all right, if this is the guy that you can acquire on the cheap, how cheap is it prospect capital wise? And that's what we're going to talk about next. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. NFL Sundays move fast, but one big play and suddenly everything can feel different. That's what makes live betting with FanDuel so exciting, because you're not just watching the game, you're reacting to it in real time. With FanDuel, you can place bets as the action unfolds. Every drive, every momentum swing, every highlight moment. Live betting is best when the game starts to shift, whether a running back or receiver gets hot, maybe a defense tightens up, or a momentum shift can happen on a turnover. FanDuel lets you jump into that moment with live spreads and money lines that adjust instantly. Player props that get updated as the guys start to heat up. You can bet next touchdown scorers, drive results, totals, and more. Keeps you locked into every snap, every drive, every possibility. So if you want to be right in the middle of the action this season, visit FanDuel.com and place your NFL live bets all season long. That's FanDuel. The game moves fast, and so can you. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Help us get closer to our next goal of 16,000 subscribers. Now, I've talked about Luis Robert on this show plenty of times, and I've gone back and forth on it plenty as well. At the deadline, it was reported that the White Sox were interested in both. It was first Jonah Tong, which was just ridiculous, but then also Mark Vientos was rumored as a target of the White Sox. They just picked up Munetaka Murakami. So I don't think that they would be in the market for Mark Vientos anymore anyway. But also looking at the Mets, and we'll talk about this more in the next segment, I think you need to keep Vientos in his power bat, because I don't know where this team is getting the power that they lost with Pete Alonso signing elsewhere. I know Jorge Polanco is going to make up for some of it, but not all of it. So I feel like you need to keep Vientos in-house, because he might be your starting first baseman for all we know. So that trade idea is gone, and that was always one that I was torn on, because you're trading 4 years of Mark Vientos for a year of Luis Robert that is overpriced. So that also didn't make a bunch of sense. It only made sense if you were committed to moving off of Vientos, and then, okay, fine. But when it comes to how far I'd go to trade for Luis Robert, would I trade Willson Acuna, as was reported at one point this offseason, another player of interest? Sure. Yeah, Willson Acuna doesn't have any options. So you can't stash him in Syracuse. And there is right now no indication, despite what he's doing in the Winter League, that would suggest that Willson Acuna is going to be a starting anything in the big leagues, a starting second baseman, shortstop, whatever. His best chance is to be a starting shortstop where the defensive value can carry him a little bit more. But for the Mets, Acuna is probably limited to the role that we've seen him play for the past year. And that's not a guy that you should be hesitant to give up if you think that Luis Robert has that high of a ceiling. But part of the report today was that the White Sox wanted pitching depth now for Luis Robert. So if I'm taking on the salary, what does pitching depth look like to me? It looks like Jonathan Pintaro and Joander Suarez. Now, Joander Suarez is not much of a prospect, but he is depth, double-A arm, who had a 3.76 ERA this past season. He did strike out about a batter per 9, and he walked less than 1.5 per 9. So throws strikes, was able to strike out double-A hitters. In AAA, numbers weren't very good in 3 starts, but a guy that's been hanging around the Mets for a long time, they haven't protected him for the last couple of Rule 5 drafts. Look, the pathway to Joander Suarez making a big league impact on the Mets is very crowded. So I think that's a guy you give up without even thinking about it. Jonathan Pintaro has some real trade value. You might say why, if you look at his numbers this past year. A 5.22 ERA in AAA. I don't have his ERA pulled up from AA. I know it was decent until he came up to the show. I can't remember if he got up to triple. I feel like he came straight from AA to the show. His numbers in AA were better. He had a 3.40 ERA and 11 starts. But the reason why Jonathan Pintaro has value is he struck out a ton of batters last year. 29% of the batters he faced in the minor leagues, he struck out. He only got 2 outs with the Mets, made 1 appearance, gave up 2 runs. So that wasn't good. And again, went to AAA, had an ERA over 5, but the strikeout rate was still strong. He does walk too many batters, but he's got sort of a funky delivery. he strides toward the third base side. He's a right-handed pitcher. So he strides toward the third base side, kind of throws a little bit across his body, not quite to the extent of Sean Manaea, but still a little bit of that kind of sidearm crossfire. It's lower than 3/4. Not, of course, dropping down submarine style like Tyler Rogers, but kind of a straight sidearm throw from Pintaro. He's got a great cutter, good fastball. He can throw in the upper 90s, especially out of the bullpen. Got a sinker, got a sweeper, has a changeup. He has a starter's arsenal and has been getting starts in the Mets system. So that to me is about as good of an arm as I'd be willing to trade for Luis Robert, unless they are eating money on this deal. If they're eating money, then things change. And there's two ways to eat money. You can just be straight eating cash, or they could take a player back in return. So if they want Jeff McNeil, and if the Mets, or if they're okay taking Jeff McNeil's salary, and if the Mets don't want Jeff McNeil on the roster, if they're of the opinion that he is part of that core that they're trying to move on from, and they're trying to clear that salary anyway, this would be an opportunity to clear all of Jeff McNeil's salary without having to eat it down in a separate trade. And now, instead of Luis Robert being a $20 million addition to the payroll, it's a $4.25 million addition. These two players have identical club options. Not club options, identical buyouts on club options that are unlikely to get picked up by their new teams. For McNeil, $15.75 million with the $2 million buyout. For Robert, another $20 million with a $2 million buyout. So money-wise, a McNeil for Robert trade makes a lot of sense. Obviously, the White Sox would want some value back, especially for taking on that Jeff McNeil contract. I still think Pintaro would be in the deal, but then maybe you would get an RJ Gordon or a Noah Hall instead of a guy in Joander Suarez, who pretty much has very little trade value anyway. RJ Gordon, Noah Hall both had really good seasons this past year. Both right now still have the outlook of maybe being big league starters. And so I could see that making some sense in a trade here. But again, for a White Sox team that was shooting for Jonah Tong or Mark Vientos, is that gap going to be bridged where you could find a McNeil for Robert trade that actually makes sense? And I tend to think not, because I think that they're going to want too much prospect capital. And if they want pitching prospects, I'm sorry, I'm not giving up any of my top 6 pitching prospects for Luis Robert when he's been bad for 2 years and cost that much money. I'm just not doing it. McLean, Tong, Sproat, obviously all off the table. I'm not trading Jack Wenninger, who I think right now is a fringe top 100 prospect in baseball. I shouldn't even say I think that. Arm Layton, for just baseball, thinks he's in the 110 range. So that would give the Mets 9 top 100 prospects. Definitely not trading him for Luis Robert. Not trading Jonathan Santucci for Luis Robert. Not trading Will Watson for Luis Robert. And I'm not trading Christian Scott for him either. So the best that I would go is when you get to that Zach Thornton, RJ Gordon, Noah Hall range, or the guy that many think can get big league outs next year, Jonathan Pintaro. So that's where I'm at when it comes to pitching prospects. That could go the other way. And so if the White Sox want pitching depth, the other move is, hey, the Mets take on the contract and they'll give you a viable big league starter for next season, either David Peterson or Kodai Senga. Now, I personally think that David Peterson, with the innings that he's going to provide you, is more valuable than what Luis Robert could potentially provide. Not what he could provide you, but it's more valuable than taking on $20 million in Luis Robert when you have a pitcher in David Peterson who's going to make like $7.5 million next year. That's extremely valuable in the game today, to have a guy that can give you 160 innings at a low 4 ERA at that dollar amount. I don't know if I would trade him. Kodai Senga has an incredibly high ceiling. And so I don't know if I would trade him for Luis Robert either, but I do think there could be some sense in a Kodai Senga for Luis Robert trade if the Mets have come to the conclusion that they no longer want to bet on the upside of Senga and they would prefer to move off of Senga so that they can make another addition to their rotation and so they can clear that money off of their books. For the White Sox, this would be the best case scenario because Kodai Senga is a better upside player than Luis Robert, and you're basically playing the same game a little bit differently of holding on to the guy with the contract, letting him go into the season, and hoping that by the trade deadline they manufacture enough value that you can flip that asset for a lot more than you would get right now. Kodai Senga before he got hurt last year, was pitching well below a 2 ERA. If he did that for the White Sox, even if Luis Robert posted an 890 OPS at the deadline, Kodai Senga would have more trade value if he was healthy and pitching that well, because pitching just gets more at the deadline in return than hitting does. And Senga's contract would look attractive again because it's $14 million for each of the next 2 years. And then there's a club optional. I think the option only vests if Senga is on the IL with Tommy John surgery. I don't think, or an elbow injury. So because he gotten hurt with leg injuries, I don't know if that club option is on the table. I don't think it is, but still 2 years, $28 million in this market is very valuable for a pitcher of Senga's caliber. It's just the risk. So you're trading risk for risk, but for the White Sox, you could really win big on this trade. He can give you a lot of good innings in the first half of the season if he's right, and then you can flip him for way more than you'll ever trade Luis Robert for. For the Mets, if you want to get off Kodai Senga anyway, this is your opportunity to rid yourselves of that contract and pick up a guy that clearly the Mets value. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been rumored to trade for this guy so many times. There's enough smoke that I think the Mets do want Luis Robert, just under the right context. Probably the perfect context for them would be Jeff McNeil maybe going the other way to offset the cash, or just the White Sox eating the cash, or the Mets taking on the salary and just not trading anything of value. Just the Pintaro Suarez trade for Robert. It's a tough trade to make. Part of me thinks that because we haven't been able to predict anything the Mets have done this offseason, that the fact that we've talked about it this much, it makes it unlikely. But I do think under the right scenario, a trade for Luis Robert could make sense for the New York Mets, but not one where you're giving up anything of major consequence, and ideally one where you're getting off of something you might deem as a problem to take a problem off the White Sox hands. So that's where I'm at with that. But I want to close the show talking about what we saw in the first base market on Sunday. I did a show on Munetaka Murakami, but then there was a Willson Contreras trade. So we're going to talk about that to close out the show here in just a minute. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. In the midst of a basketball season, there's nothing like being in the building, to feel the crowd, the energy, the moments that you can't get from watching on the couch. The only problem, getting tickets is just a hassle. Or at least it used to be before Game Time, because Game Time removes those long queues, the tough login, the prices that can change at checkout. Game Time is a game changer because it puts the advantage back in the fans' hands, making scoring great seats to NBA games fast, easy, and stress-free. What I love about Game Time is you can view your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. And I love the all-in pricing, because I would hate going to the checkout screen and then all of a sudden seeing that fee that just hiked up the price. With all-in pricing, you're not going to be surprised at checkout. And I also love that you can get zone deals with Game Time. So you pick your section. Game Time is going to pick your seat, but you are going to save even more money this way. You can take the guesswork out of buying your NBA tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's code LOCKEDONMLB, LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On #1 sports podcast network. You already live your team every day. Now it's time to take it up a level and go ad-free. Join the Everydayer Club today and get Locked On Mets with no interruptions, members-only Discord access, and more, all for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Go to lockedonmets.supercast.com or check the link in the show notes to learn more. Now, Willson Contreras, who at one point in time I really wanted on the New York Mets, he's been traded to the Red Sox following Sonny Gray, his Cardinals teammate, who I also wanted on the New York Mets. So I guess I'm a Craig Breslow fan because he's trading for all the guys I wanted. Willson Contreras goes from the Cardinals to the Red Sox in exchange for 3 pitching prospects. Hunter Dobbins is the headliner because he had a 4.13 ERA, mostly out of the rotation, kind of a swingman for the Red Sox this past year. He's coming off an ACL tear, his second ACL tear, I believe in the same knee too, so you don't love that. But 26 years old, and the Cardinals probably view him as legitimate starter depth for their rotation. I believe they also got Richard Fitz in the other trade. I think he was in the Sonny Gray trade. So in their mind, they've picked up a couple of viable big league starters from the Red Sox this offseason. You also have 19-year-old, I'm going to completely butcher this name, Jorge Fajardo, and 22-year-old Blake Ida, who complete the package, both right-handers. Fajardo had a 2.25 ERA between the FCL, the Complex League, and Low A. He throws 97. There's still hope that he can be a starting pitcher. Same can be said for Ida, who finished last year in High A. I saw some people comparing this package and saying, oh, the Mets were right to not make this trade because this is like trading Brandon Sproat and Jonathan Santucci or Brandon Sproat and Christian Scott. They didn't get a single piece that's close to Brandon Sproat in value. I get that Hunter Dobbins showed that he could probably be a big league starter, but Brandon Sproat's a top 100 prospect, and he's not coming off another ACL tear. I get he's a pitcher, but that doesn't scream durability. Brandon Sproat, if he was put on the table, would have gotten this trade done. But there was no world where the Mets were going to trade Brandon Sproat for Willson Contreras. Now, Jonathan Santucci, I could see Jonathan Santucci being the headliner and a couple lower-level arms, but I think Jonathan Santucci is better than any pitching prospect that the Cardinals got back in this trade. I mean, again, Hunter Dobbins, viable big league starter depth immediately once he's healthy. The other two pitching prospects, still a viable chance that they become big league starting pitchers. But Jonathan Santucci just pitched to a 2.25 ERA in 2.52 ERA in 10 starts in Double-A, and he struck out 63 batters in 50 innings. That was in Double-A. He's a better prospect, certainly, than the other two guys that they got. And Hunter Dobbins, yes, a little bit of a different situation because he's proven himself in the big leagues to a certain extent. But I still think Santucci would have more value, and I certainly know for sure that Sproat has more value. So I think some Mets people who are trying to make this a situation where, the Mets, couldn't have made this trade, or if they did, they would have traded too much. We're not comparing apples to apples on the trade package. If you're telling me that anything that the Cardinals just got is comparable to Brandon Sproat, because it's not. And I don't think anything they got is even comparable to Jonathan Santucci. Hunter Dobbins, Christian Scott, that's a comparable comp, right? That I can kind of get my head around. But I mean, to me, the package, a Mets comp for what the Cardinals just got back would be like Jonathan Pintaro, Jonathan Santucci, and Jonathan Jimenez. And yes, I did put 3 Jonathans in one trade, not on purpose until I looked at what I had come up with. But Pintaro is Hunter Dobbins adjacent, not nearly as good, but, maybe call that 70 cents a Dobbins and call Jonathan Santucci 130 cents better than 130 cents to the dollar of anything else in the deal. Bottom line, Santucci would have been a piece that really carried a package to get Contreras, but I don't know if I would have put Santucci on the table to get Contreras. When I was mocking trades, I was talking Mark Vientos for Contreras straight up, where they get 4 years of Vientos, who's a lot cheaper, and you're taking the contract off the Cardinals' hands. The fact that they wanted pitching and they got 3 pitchers in the deal, I don't know if the Mets want to trade this much pitching for a position that they have already addressed by signing Jorge Polanco. And that's also what I wanted to come back to here. I discussed this a bunch on the Munetaka Murakami show that I did on Sunday. I did a 2-segment show just breaking down the fact that the contract was way less than what we expected, but why the Mets were probably not in on this. And that's because they're not trying to invest a combination between Polanco and another addition of $37 million, $38 million on the DH first base position. I don't think that Ryan O'Hearn's coming to the Mets. I am doubtful that Kazuma Okamoto is coming to the Mets because I think he's going to do better than Murakami just did. And I don't know if the Mets want to sign a guy who's in his 30s to a 5-year deal, which he might get at potentially 15 plus million. So I don't know if that is a move the Mets would make. I don't think that they would necessarily sign Eugenio Suarez unless it's like a 1-year deal. And I think he probably gets 2 years on the market out there somewhere. And again, who knows? The Mets might not even though Suarez hit 49 homers, they might not value that much money invested to the first base position. There are other options right now in free agency, Paul Goldschmidt or Carlos Santana. I could maybe see a Paul Goldschmidt fit for the Mets. because of the defense and his ability to hit left-handed pitching, if he falls to like a $5 million deal. But when you get a guy like Paul Goldschmidt, at a certain point, it's the same reason that we saw Anthony Rizzo not sign a deal and retire. It gets to a point where they're not really going to get out of bed for that much money, where they're not trying to just play it out forever. If they can get $10 million, worth it to go out for another year. Or maybe for Goldschmidt, it makes sense if you are going to accept that type of a contract to go sign with Arizona, right? And go finish where you spent, a majority of your career. That makes a little bit of sense. Now that I think the Cardinals are going to use, so I don't know if that would be a fit for Goldie. Carlos Santana is another defensive-minded first baseman in free agency that's old, but you're not getting much offense from either of those guys. Luis Ariz or Rhys Hoskins are on the market, and there's offensive upside with both, but terrible defenders. Yandy Diaz is a trade candidate, but another terrible defender. He could be your DH, but I also don't know if the Rays are going to trade Yandy. I always felt like they were going to trade one of Yandy Diaz or Brandon Lau. Now that they traded Lau, I think they just keep Yandy to be a pretty cost-controlled DH for them, because they're not going to just punt this season. They're still going to try to win. And if the season does go poorly, they trade Yandy at the deadline. So I think what we could be heading towards here is the Mets are going to stay internal at the first base DH position, where you got Jorge Polanco, former shortstop. You hope he can figure out first base. You got Mark Vientos, who I'm sure at this point is working more at first than he is at third. And so he could be your answer. Ronnie Mauricio, I think, would be a great defender at first. Is he going to hit enough? We'll see. But I think you give him reps at first and third in Syracuse so he can be an insurance policy at either corner infield spot for the upcoming season, because your expectation is that Marcus Semien is going to play almost every day at second base. And you still have Brett Beatty that can shift over there. You still have, for now, Acuna or McNeil that can shift over there. So that's where I would be focusing Mauricio at first and third to give you some depth. You have Ryan Clifford, who very well could be your first baseman of the future that could be up midseason. And if they don't trade Jeff McNeil, he can play first base too, as just another iron in the fire. So I think based on what's on the market, what the Mets just let past them on the market, I kind of feel like they're going to stay put at first base and DH. So Jorge Polanco really was the Pete Alonso replacement, and they're comfortable with Vientos as a bounce back candidate, with McNeil potentially just being insurance everywhere, and with Ryan Clifford being a guy that they could view as the future at the position, and Mauricio just being another option. I think they might not address first base, and if that's the case, they better address that corner outfield spot or center field. Now, if the Mets just went out and traded for Luis Robert and didn't do anything else to address their lineup, could it be a good enough team? Absolutely. Are you carrying a lot of ifs into the season? Absolutely, because you still don't know who's actually going to play first. You, at that point, would have no idea if Luis Robert was going to be an above-average hitter. You're betting on Carson Bench, a rookie, and if you trade Jeff McNeil in that deal, you remove insurance in a lot of places. I still don't know where the Mets are at here when it comes to Jeff McNeil. It's a puzzle to me, because ultimately Jeff McNeil, based on what you've done this offseason, should get traded. Because if you move on from Nimmo, Alonso, and Diaz, it feels a little bit weird that Jeff McNeil just gets to hang out for one more year. With that said, I said it before, I'll say it again. Jeff McNeil in free agency right now is the best second baseman available. He is definitely a top 5 corner outfielder. You got Tucker, you got Bellinger, and then who's the next best guy? Is Yastrzemski still out there? Or no, didn't he sign? He might have signed with the Braves, right? Is Talkman still out there? Austin Hayes, Max Kepler, Michael Conforto. I mean, Randall Grichuk, I think, is still a free agent. Miguel Andujar, but he's more of a third baseman than an outfielder. There's not a lot of options. So when you talk about this roster, Jeff McNeil just covers up so much for a team that seems to have holes kind of all over the place right now. But I think if this is a year where you still invest in this rotation one way or the other, whether it's free agency or whether it's trading some of your top prospects. If you further build out the bullpen and you correct the pitching, and you're still going to go into next season with Juan Soto and Francisco Lindor, hoping that you get progression from Brett Beatty and Francisco Alvarez, banking on Carson Bench being an answer right away as a rookie, and then you brought in Polanco, and you hope that he's going to help the offense, and Simeon's going to help you defensively, and you're betting on a little bit of a bounce back there. It's a lot of bets that you're making, but I can see for a team that offense wasn't the problem last year, I could see Juan Soto carrying you to a top 5 offense in baseball anyway. And if your run prevention's better, you could be a better team. But it's still going to be a tough sell for fans going to spring training if they don't just sign Cody Bellinger or trade for Jarren Duran. I mean, those are still the two moves that make this offense feel complete, both from a run prevention standpoint and offensively. And so we'll just have to see what happens there. If the Mets jump the market on Luis Robert, though, and they pick up Robert, that's going to be the completion of their outfield. And I'd be very curious at that point. One, is McNeil in that trade? And if he is, okay, now are you more able to sign an Okamoto? Now are you more able to, pick up a Gino Suarez, something like that, to boost your DH because you went run prevention in the outfield with Robert and in the infield with Simeon to replace Nimmo and Alonso, two offensive-minded pieces. Yes, you picked up one in Polanco, but then I would hope at least, if you traded for Robert, that you would do something else at first base and DH. But the way the Mets are moving, I feel like it's an outfield addition and that's it. And that's why I'd still hold out hope for Duran or Bellinger. But that's going to be all for this edition of Locked On Mets. I appreciate all of you for tuning in to a little bit of a longer show today. Thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, review wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. And thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network.